This story has bloodthirsty sharks, ruthless Japanese, suicide torpedoes, an atomic bomb, a series of unbelievable coincidences, and the worst disaster in the history of the U.S. Navy. Sometimes reality is more dramatic than any fiction, especially at the end of a world war. So it's July 1945. Japan is hopelessly losing the war, but still has no intention of surrendering. It's the middle of the night somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. The American cruiser Indianapolis is sailing from the island of Guam to the island of Leyte. And halfway through this otherwise routine route, it runs into one of the few Japanese submarines left, the I-58. By the start of World War II, the Indianapolis was already not a new ship, but it was still a reliable heavy cruiser. Up until 1945, there was nothing particularly remarkable in its service record. The cruiser escorted convoys, protected aircraft carriers, and provided fire support for amphibious landings. In 1943, the Indianapolis intercepted and sank a Japanese transport ship. The cruiser took part in fierce battles for the Amikin Atoll and even served as the flagship for Admiral Spruance, one of America's greatest naval commanders. Since the fall in 1944, the Indianapolis was commanded by Charles McVay III, a career naval officer. His father, Charles McVay II, rose to the rank of admiral. The son followed in his footsteps. However, this was the first time the younger McVay commanded a ship. He had spent the entire war in Washington, working at Naval Intelligence Headquarters, and was now making up for lost time. In 1945, under his command, the Indianapolis took part in the fierce battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. During the fighting for Okinawa, a Japanese bomber broke through the cruiser's air defenses and managed to drop a bomb. It tore through the ship from top to bottom and exploded in the water. 9 men were killed, but otherwise the cruiser was able to make it back to base under its own power. After repairs, the Indianapolis was given a critical secret mission. It was on this ship that parts of the atomic bomb, which would later be dropped on Hiroshima, were transported from San Francisco to the island of Tinian. From Tinian, the Indianapolis sailed to Guam, where veteran crew members were discharged and replaced with new recruits. And on July 28, 1945, the cruiser set out on its final voyage, from Guam to Leyte. The Japanese submarine I-58 entered service late in the war. It only joined the active fleet in December 1944 and had no victories to boast of. Its commander, Mochitsura Hashimoto, was the 5th son of a Shinto priest. He spent most of the war commanding training submarines. You couldn't really call him a sea wolf, but he was a diligent man. End of the war or not, his mission was standard: search for Americans along their main routes and try to sink someone. Between Guam and Leyte, he came across a tanker with a destroyer escort and fired torpedoes at him. Since the weather was terrible, the Japanese couldn't tell whether they hit anything or not. But just in case, they reported to headquarters that the tanker had been sunk. Meanwhile, things were pretty dull on the Indianapolis. There was a storm. The neighboring ships radioed that they had detected a Japanese submarine and were attacking it. Late in the evening, McVay ordered an end to anti-submarine maneuvers and for the ship to continue straight ahead. The report about the submarine wasn't taken seriously. Well, first of all, it was far away, and second, who knows what the tanker crew actually saw. At that moment, the Japanese were already watching the Indianapolis through binoculars, trying to figure out what kind of target they had found. Hashimoto gave the order to dive and headed toward the target. The torpedo tubes were prepared for a K. In addition to regular torpedoes, the submarine was carrying chitons, which are torpedoes piloted by suicide attackers. Hashimoto had already used several chitons, but none of them hit their targets. This time, they decided not to use the chitons. Launching them was noisy, preparing them for battle took a long time, and in the darkness, the suicide pilots could easily miss. So they fired regular torpedoes. At a distance of 1.5 kilometers, Hashimoto launched a spread of 6 torpedoes. At 12:15 on July 30th, 2 of these torpedoes hit their target. One hit the bow, and the other pierced the hull right below Captain McVay's bridge, who at that moment was sleeping in his cabin and was thrown from his bunk. The internal communication systems failed, so to stop the ship, they had to send someone to the engine room. The cruiser kept moving forward, taking on water through the torn open bow. The list was rapidly getting worse. 8 minutes after the first explosion, one of the officers summed it up: "We're done for." The ship's doctor, Medic Lewis Haynes, had spent the previous day giving cholera vaccinations to all the crew members. It was an exhausting task. That evening, the doctor even turned down a poker game with his fellow officers and instead went to bed early. He woke up to the first explosion, which threw him from his bunk to the ceiling, then hit again. Haynes grabbed his life jacket and rushed out of his cabin, where something was already on fire. In the corridor, there was a terrifying flash and his face was burned. Haynes slipped, fell onto his hands, and immediately burned his palms on the searing hot metal. Then he inhaled poisonous smoke, got completely lost, and at that point decided to just lie there and wait for death until another sailor fell on top of him. That snapped him out of his stupor. In the darkness, someone had managed to open a porthole and there was a rope hanging outside. Haynes climbed up to the deck using a rope and got ready to bandage the wounded and put life jackets on them, but he didn't have time to do it. The wounded started sliding across the deck, and then a ship's seaplane broke loose and crashed down on top of them. At that moment, Haynes jumped overboard. All this happened in just a few minutes. Captain McVeigh gave the order to abandon ship, but it was impossible to relay it to his subordinates, and there was no need. People were already jumping into the water on their home. The engines were never shut down. And in the darkness, in the panic, some sailors ended up under the massive propellers, which tore people apart. The Indianapolis sank in just 12 minutes. In those 12 minutes, out of nearly 1,200 people on board, about 300 died. The explosion from one of the torpedoes killed almost the entire regular Marine detachment on the ship. Some couldn't get out of the sealed compartments, others were cut off by fires, but about 900 people, led by the captain, were now floating in the water. Most of the life-saving equipment sank along with the ship. The survivors could only hope for a quick rescue operation. The Indianapolis's radio station managed to send out a distress signal. Moreover, U.S. Navy intelligence intercepted a Japanese message about the sinking of a large ship in the area where the Indianapolis was located. But both the first message and the second one were completely ignored. At intelligence headquarters, they simply brushed off the report. The Japanese liked to boast about fake victories, and the intelligence officers had become numb to such claims. An alarm could have been raised the next day on Leyte Island when the cruiser didn't show up. But there, they just shrugged. Well, it's late, so light. Who knows why? Meanwhile, the situation at the disaster site was getting worse and worse. Not everyone got a life jacket. Some clung to debris, while others managed to get onto life rafts. Many swallowed fuel oil when they hit the water, and now they were vomiting. Others developed diarrhea, which very quickly led to severe dehydration, and there was no fresh water to be found. The main group was drifting in the water in a small area where the ship had sunk. There were about 400 people there. Smaller groups floated nearby. For example, Captain McVeigh ended up on a raft about 10 kilometers away from the main group of sinking sailors. Another group was led by the cruiser's Marine commander. He was an excellent swimmer and would swim out himself to retrieve those who started drifting away into the ocean. The sun was blazing down from the sky, and many were burned, wounded, or had broken something while trying to escape the ship. Everyone, without exception, was covered in a thick layer of fuel oil. Pretty quickly, people started suffering from the cold. The water in this part of the Pacific is warm, but that's only if you're swimming, not if you're stuck in it for days on end. In some places, fights broke out over life jackets. Some people got too tired to keep fighting, lost consciousness, and died. Others started hallucinating. Some tore off their life jackets and drowned. Someone shouted, "There's a Japanese here, he's trying to kill me." Someone thought they saw an island. Many couldn't take it anymore and started desperately drinking salt water, which led to a painful death. And then the sharks appeared, the so-called oceanic white-tip shark. Normally, oceanic white-tip sharks feed on fish and the bodies of mammals, but they're actually omnivorous and will attack anything that moves, just in case. They rarely attack people in coastal waters, but they eagerly feed on shipwreck and plane crash victims in the open ocean. There was simply nothing to fight them off with. Every now and then, one of the sailors would start screaming, then the water around him would turn red with blood, and the victim would disappear forever. It's hard to say how many people the sharks ate this way, but it's believed that at least 150 sailors, not counting those who were already dead by then, were lost. More than 3 days passed like this. Finally, at 10:25 a.m. on August 2nd, a patrol plane flew over the site of the disaster. The pilot first saw a huge oil slick and then noticed a massive group of people below. Soon after, a Catalina flying boat arrived. It dropped several life rafts, but missed the target. The crew commander, Lieutenant Commander Adrian Marks, later recalled that he saw wild scenes from the air. Sharks were devouring lone swimmers in small groups right before his eyes. The sight was so unbearable that he ignored the orders forbidding landing a flying boat in open sea and touched down right on the water. The plane was badly damaged in the process, but it stayed afloat. Marks was able to rescue 58 people. People were packed inside and even tied to the wings with ropes. The Catalina couldn't take off anymore, but that wasn't necessary. Soon, other rescue planes appeared in the sky. They dropped life rafts, containers with food, water, and radios. Then a destroyer arrived, and during the night, 2 more ships came. The rescuers' first priority was to get people off the flying boat. At that moment, Lieutenant Marks had no idea he would be awarded a medal for heroism and was absolutely convinced he would be disgraced and demoted for damaging military property. Out of the Indianapolis crew, 316 people survived, a third of those who were left in the water after the ship sank. Ship's Dr. Haynes regained consciousness when the medics were trying to wash the fuel off him. Then he vomited up oil, lost consciousness again, and only woke up 12 hours later when he was being loaded onto a hospital ship bound for Guam. He was left with scars from burns on his heels and palms as a reminder. Charles McVeigh III was court-martialed. He was accused of not performing anti-torpedo maneuvers and of giving the order to abandon ship too late. In response, McVeigh insisted that he had requested an anti-submarine escort for his ship, but didn't receive one, because all the destroyers were occupied. Mochitsuru Hashimoto safely brought a submarine back from the mission and learned 2 pieces of news in port. First, Japan had surrendered, and second, his entire family had died during the nuclear attack on Hiroshima, which was carried out with the very bomb whose components had been delivered to the assembly site by the Indianapolis. Soon after, Hashimoto was brought to America to testify as a witness at the trial of McVeigh. Hashimoto insisted that the American captain was not at fault. The conditions for the attack were perfect. No anti-submarine zigzags would have made a difference, and he would have sunk the Indianapolis either way. Despite this, McVeigh was found guilty. He got off with a purely formal punishment. His promising career ended up being somewhat stalled, but that was it. He became the only captain during the entire war to be court-martialed for losing a ship. There's a theory that rivals within the Navy command used this as a way to settle scores with his father. In 1948, McVeigh retired with the rank of Rear Admiral. Until the end of his life, he was tormented by the relatives of those who died, who sent him angry letters and called him with insults. But the surviving subordinates, on the contrary, never blamed him for anything. They believed that the captain had been made a scapegoat, and even tried to fight for his reputation. Notably, the American government eventually came to the same conclusion, and on October 30th, 2000, McVeigh was posthumously exonerated by a resolution of the U.S. Congress. 5 days before President Clinton signed this document, an elderly Shinto priest quietly passed away in Kyoto. His name was Mochitsuru Hashimoto. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. We have many more interesting videos ahead.